If you would move down toward the front so everybody can see and hear better. Good morning once again, everyone. It is still okay to move forward a little bit. We're not in high school anymore. It's okay to sit in these nice plush seats in front, but I'll leave that to you. Welcome to this special adult enrichment. We're really privileged to have two highly skilled people from the Presbyterian Historical Society. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves in more detail, but I will introduce them briefly here. Nancy Taylor, who's right here, and then is Lucy in the room, or is she not here yet? We'll introduce her when she comes back in. There she is. There's Lucy. They will tell you in more detail what they do at the Presbyterian Historical Society, but this morning they're going to talk about the Society's mission and institutional priorities and lead a discussion about the transformative power of history. And if that wasn't a true statement, we wouldn't be having such a large cultural debate about this right now. So Nancy, I will turn things over to you.
Grace and peace to all of you. I am so happy to be with you today in your beautiful sanctuary and with such wonderful music. Can everyone hear me? Those of you in the very back? Okay, good. I am here with my colleague, Lucy Duxon-Bramble, and also we're just thrilled to be in the company of John Wilkinson. And together we had planned this trip to the Twin Cities area, and John said we need to go to House of Hope, and I'm so glad that he did. I am going to share with you some of the journey that we are on as an institution of the church, and I don't think folks were able to come up here and pick things up. You can do that afterwards, but Lucy is going to help pass out our current mission statement, and I'm hoping all of you will have that because I'm going to talk some about that. So that's going to start coming around. The Presbyterian Historical Society was organized in 1852 by the Presbyterian Church in the USA Old School General Assembly. So we're just slightly older than your congregation. We have always been in Philadelphia, and we have always been an archive that fell under the aegis of the national denomination. Unlike a lot of other mainline denominations, we are the archive for the whole country. There are no regional repositories, so everything, congregation records, mid-council records, those things come to us in Philadelphia. We have a staff of about 20 people currently, and we offer a number of services for the church. And I'm going to say briefly about those, but I want you to think back. If we were founded in 1852, what our collection must have changed over the years, what kinds of things people thought was important to collect. And if you think in 1852, where all of the records were handwritten, session minutes, registers, there were, of course, libraries that ministers collected and printed publications. That was where we started, and today we have a lot of born digital records in our collection. I think almost every congregation, no matter how small, is probably creating their session minutes now on computers. The audio-visual capacity to communicate almost immediately with folks about history has really transformed what we do. But that is a kind of a long arc that we have been on as an institution. And we have been paying particular attention to our history as an institution and a ministry of the church, and how we can better meet where this moment in the United States and in the denomination, as John talked about, as I'm sure you know, this is a moment yet again when people are talking about history and what kind of history people should be exposed to, how history can help inform conversations, and then how that might help shape where we decide to go as a church, as a community, as a society in the future. So did everyone get the handout? Okay, good. I started working at PHS in 1999, and our tagline at that point was collect, preserve, and share. And we still do all three of those things. But over the last 10 years or so, we found ourselves really looking at our collection and realizing there were a lot of gaps, right? So we had kind of taken in records that documented the leadership of the church over that 150 plus years. We have lots of General Assembly minutes. We have lots of books of session minutes and church registers. And we've always been a very strong collection to document mission in the church. So we have lots of foreign mission records, both the Board of Foreign Missions and of missionaries who served all over the world. But we started asking ourselves, do we have enough to tell what we think is more of a full story, more of a nuanced story of the church in this country? And if not, what can we do to start addressing that? So beginning in about 2015, the first area that really came to our attention was through the Covenant Network. And I think this church is a member of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians. Pam Byers had been the first director of the Covenant Network, and after she passed away, a group of folks talked with our staff. They wanted to remember her and to really capture the way she was a bridge builder and how she was able to forward understanding of LGBTQIA inclusion in the church. So rather than do a testimonial book or some kind of capture that wouldn't necessarily live on and help support the legacy of her work, collectively, folks came to the conclusion that why not partner with the Historical Society and make an intentional effort to bring in materials into our collection that really documented the full breadth of that 40-year fight for gay ordination and much more lifted up the voices of gay and lesbian, LGBTQIA plus folks, Presbyterians within this denomination. And so we were able to raise some money, we were able to hire an archivist, and by intentional collecting, what I mean by that is we didn't just kind of wait for people to contact us. We identified people out there in the church that we felt we wanted to make sure their stories were part of our collection. Sometimes that was through just oral histories. Sometimes people had collections that they had saved, papers, journals, correspondence, photographs, that they might be willing to donate to us. And I will share that because we started this with the Covenant Network, one of the first big groups of organizational records we took in were the records of the Covenant Network. But about 10 years before we started this, More Light Presbyterians was thinking about where to place their archive. And at that point, because we were an entity of the national church, and this was before gay ordination was approved and before marriage equality, there was a distrust there. And so More Light Presbyterians ended up putting some of their records at Rutgers University. And so we had to overcome some of that, are you going to honor our history? Are you going to share it with respect? Are you going to allow people to use it without any kind of filter? And we have come a long way, I will tell you, in this last 10 years, and the Pam Byers Memorial Collection really did help us do that. We have learned so much from doing this work. Not only are we, because this is an ongoing effort, building what we think is a collection that will help researchers well into the future, but by examining ourselves and thinking about how to do a better job, how to lift up voices that are long silenced, how to make available records for a much fuller and understanding of history now and in the future. That has really transformed us, and we now are engaged in a ministry to help that same kind of availability of multiple perspectives, multiple voices, multiple histories, enrich the denomination, enrich the research of scholars, students, and that is something that I am sharing with you today, and I hope to get a little bit of feedback from you about how we might be able to do a better job. A little bit of additional context about who we are. We are a public institution. We are the archives of the denomination, but we are open to the public. Researchers can come and do research in Philadelphia, but I do urge you to look at our website because we have a lot of resources now available to people all over the world who do not even need to set foot in Philadelphia. Although if you're coming, I urge you to come and visit us. We're in the historic part of Philadelphia, about 6 blocks from Independence Hall. We have made a very intentional effort to share much more than we used to because we don't want to be just a storage place. There's a stereotype of archives. They're kind of musty, dusty, places that just hold things and people come to them. And we feel like at this time in our history, we need to be able to go out to people. And we really see this much more than we used to as a ministry, both to the denomination and to other people who want to be able to investigate a complicated, complex history and deal with that and share it out themselves. We do some history telling and storytelling ourselves because we think that's a way to lift up voices that are long silenced, but we also want to enable congregations and individuals to do that same thing. And so that is our current trajectory. In terms of how we are able to do this, I have mentioned the Pam Byers Memorial Collection, and we have a flyer, a one sheet up here that you're please welcome to take and learn more. In 2018, we started an African American Leaders and Congregations Collecting Initiative. And it's not like we didn't have any records that documented Black Presbyterians, but we tended to have General Assembly level records about ministries and programs to people of color and specifically African Americans, and not a lot of the actual voices of African American Presbyterians over this 150 plus years. And so we have made a very intentional effort to bring in congregation records of primarily or historic African American churches, and we are doing a lot of oral histories. That is one way to really hear from people. We have also unearthed a lot of interesting audio and video, and you can probably imagine we have audio in tons of different formats, reel-to-reel tapes, do you remember those? Cassette tapes, as we get a little bit closer to the present, digital audio. But the way that we discover these things, we hope you can still play them, and we digitize those reel-to-reel tapes and make them accessible through our digital archive, again, through our website. So that has been a way through oral history, through digitizing old audio, that we are trying to have different perspectives and voices be part of our historic record. One other thing that has happened very recently is we got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to help us make accessible a huge photograph collection. It's from the Religious News Service, which was kind of the AP of religious news from about 1945 to 1980 is the scope of our collection. 60,000 photographs that were really starting to deteriorate because there's a lot of acetate negatives. We are going to digitize about a third of those, make them available to everyone through our website, and preserve the entire collection. And I offer up these examples because 2/3 of our budget does come from per capita. We are the National Archives. We are part of your denomination. But a third of that we acquire through fundraising or through grants. And that is really part of this journey that I am telling you about. We decided we needed to be outward facing. We needed to share what was in our collection. We needed to be more thought-provoking for our researchers and our patrons. And bringing in that money on top of per capita has really allowed us to do that. If you look at the Collect, Preserve, Share, Transform, we started about a year and a half ago, the staff and the board, to think that we wanted to revise our mission statement. And that was really to capture the work that we were doing and in the direction we hope to continue to go. So we did add transform to that tagline. We almost decided to get rid of that altogether, but people really like that. It's easy to remember: collect, preserve, share. But we are doing all of that in order to be a transformative ministry of the church. And I wanted to just share briefly, if you look toward the bottom, those are our three, below the images, those are our three current institutional priorities. And this started, I was thinking about this, other folks were thinking exactly how to capture where we think we are in this moment and where we want to go. And I was in worship one morning at Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church, where I'm a member, and in the affirmation of faith in the bulletin, there were, we read and there were excerpts printed from the brief statement of faith. And these words that are now part of our institutional priorities did resonate with me. At that point, I wasn't sure. It was like, okay, this is important, but I'm not quite sure how we may use this. And the way that the brief statement in this particular place captures what we have been trying to do is to hear the voices of people long silenced, to create space for that in the historical record. And then why do we do that? I think as Presbyterians who are committed to that, we do want this work to collectively bring us to a place of justice, freedom, and peace. This is hugely ambitious for an archive for anyone, I will completely admit that, but it has really energized our staff, our feeling of having a call to what we do, and I hope to be able to relate that to where the PCUSA is today. One other thing I want to share with you, and then I'm going to ask you some questions and you can ask me questions. A year ago at the General Assembly, there was an item of business passed by Race and Gender Justice Committee. It came through that committee and was approved by the whole General Assembly. And it gave us a direction. We are instructed to do something, and I'm going to read it word for word so you have it. Direct the Presbyterian Historical Society to create an online historical self-study tool for congregations and mid-councils to investigate their own history. And then the caveat here, it's not, yes, history, but the tool should guide congregations and mid-councils in exploring and reflecting upon their history's impact on the lives of people of color, past and present. So this was a direction that we got from the General Assembly a year ago, and we have been working on enhancing and refining self-study tools on our website geared specifically to PCUSA congregations to start that work of examining how congregations and entities of the church, how their history has impacted people of color, past and present. I think you all know that the congregations in the PCUSA are very diverse. They vary in terms of size, in location. And so this is it's been a challenging task for us. How do we create tools that a lot of different churches can kind of use, can enter depending on where they currently are? And so I would love to have you, if you want to share now or afterward, do you have ideas for us, input for us about what might help House of Hope or other Presbyterian congregations or other congregations that you've been part of? What kinds of resources could we provide that would help in that examination of history? Are there ideas that come to mind for you all? Yes. Yes.
She just recently had a post about being in a church in Missouri and helping that church reconcile its past with issues of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another reflection on it. I think that's an issue
Yes.
And then I think guidance with ways to navigate that process would be something that I think a lot of churches would be appreciative of. Like,
Yes.
how do we get started? What do we do?
Right.
You know, yeah, this is awful, but it's part of our history. How do we, what do we do?
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you.
Nancy, maybe repeat maybe what, I'm not sure if I heard.
Oh, okay. And I'm sorry, I don't know your names. Okay, Gail. She shared that there's been a recent reflection. Diana Butler Bass was at a church in Missouri, and that congregation had, I believe, started a process of trying to study how slavery directly related to the history of their congregation. And she thought that the Presbyterian Historical Society could develop some ways that congregations can start that process, or if they've already started, I'm adding this myself, already started different ways they can kind of, we can suggest to continue that examination forward and bring it really into the life of the church as the congregation thinks about their ministry going forward. So, yes.
We have the same thing here. We have Reverend Neal, who started House of Hope in McAllister College. They have disowned him. He was a brilliant leader, a brilliant historian, just brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And he has been, in a sense, disowned. And I did some looking up, and he was the one who came after what they call the 1862 Dakota Uprising. I mean, he individually went to people and got their stories, so he was obviously a historian. But nobody talks about him because he was thinking the way people thought at that time. He felt, it's recorded, that the people were possibly inferior. Not that they should have thought that way, but they did. And I think it becomes something kind of like a little ghost that sits around, just a little ghost, but it's a ghost. And saying, do we disown him? Do we don't acknowledge him? Do we not put anything up? We got a sign, but we're done with it. And it's an offer. It's very important.
Can you all not? Okay. What was his name again? I'm sorry.
Neil, it's not
Edward Duffield Neal, the founder of both House of Hope and McAllister College. And you said he's essentially become kind of someone that we don't talk about, it's a very complicated thing to deal with because he was a person kind of in his time and context. But because of some things he said in particular about the Dakota, after the Dakota Uprising and potentially other things, I'm not sure, that it is how, I think what I will add on to this, what kinds of resources might open back up that conversation? That's excellent because I think there are a lot of instances like this where you have a history that is more well known. You have leaders who were using words to describe what was happening in their context. I don't think those should be hidden away. I do think that it's not enough just to study Dr. Neal, Reverend Neal. I think you have to ask what other experiences and perspectives might help give a better sense of him, but how that kind of thinking and that kind of leadership in positive and negative ways was impacting, for example, both House of Hope, the members here, how they saw this area and what they might have been doing in terms of interactions, seeking voices of for example, the Dakota, who were impacted by decisions that the church, the government, other forces of kind of power at that time were making. Do you all know Alona Street Stewart? She is local to this area, but she's the Synod exec at Synod of Lakes and Prairies. She, every time I hear her speak about situations like that, very, very complicated parts of history that have to kind of be unpacked, right? She has a really good way of doing that in a very much not threatening way, encouraging conversation, encouraging shifts of perspective. But then really, I agree with her. I don't know that it's enough just to have that conversation and stop. So what is it that knowing this information and trying to really wrestle with it, this history, what does that mean for the present of the church and for the future? And she has suggestions about that. I think it might take some people and congregations quite a long time to do that unpacking and to feel like they can actually speak about these issues. It's not going to be a cookie cutter approach, and so I would try to take some of what I'm learning from Alona and incorporate that into the resources that we might offer. This is a journey for everyone, but I think it's an important journey, and we're hoping to try to be a crucial part of that. So thank you for that. Yes.
First of all, I think the word transform is really important in this conversation about how we move from where we've been and transform some. But a less controversial subject, when the pandemic started, I was really wanting to know what the church did with the 1919 flu and what congregations were doing.
Right.
I never could find anything. So knowing about this resource, because I think that's another place where what was the role of the church when at times of either an illness or some other kind of thing might help us think about what's the role of the church for climate change.
Mm-hmm. I'm smiling. Well, you brought up that you had tried to find what the church was doing in response to the 1919 influenza, Spanish flu epidemic. And I was smiling because we tried to do that as well at the Presbyterian Historical Society, and we were shocked that there was just not very much information about that. It surprised us, and I am not still sure exactly why that is. I think they may not have realized for a while that this was important work to document, but I think it was much more diffuse than the coronavirus pandemic was in terms of having the church feel like they would make statements from the national level. That's right, and it came right at the heels of World War I. So we were shocked. I do not have a definitive answer about why there's not a good historical record about that, but my guess is there's things out there. And then you tied that into climate change, and I think there are so many pressing issues, and climate change is definitely one of the ones at the top right now, that people want to be able to talk about that both historically, currently, and going forward. There's been environmental justice within this denomination for quite a long time, but the impact of climate change is, I think, new in terms of how impactful it is and how crucial it seems. I would love to be able to facilitate both a collecting of stories around that and resources that help churches think about that. I think history for any of these really pressing issues right now, is an important perspective, because it's not that history repeats itself verbatim, right? It's not that nothing ever changes, but I think that we can learn a lot by critically examining what we know about history. If you start asking yourselves, well, what perspectives are in here? If I try to shift and think about how this might be impacting, how this impacted people, the influenza pandemic of 1919, that aren't part of the history books, I think you start to look at current history, current things in a different way and start to ask different questions. And it's not as if nothing good was happening in the past. I mean, you can actually get quite a lot of inspiration from history. But it's just being a kind of, it's taking a critical perspective, and how does that change the thinking now and going forward is kind of what we're trying to do. So, yeah. Yeah.
Don't need to revert back to what we were talking
No, please.
about. I just came back from 18 days up in British Columbia, and I visited islands that were mostly inhabited. They don't call them Native Americans, they call them indigenous. I was flabbergasted at all the interest that was put toward the indigenous people. They were given their land back, and it was so positive that they thought, where did we go wrong? It was a drastic difference from what we have in America. I was very pleased to see that.
So I am not going to keep trying to repeat questions because people are doing that so well themselves. Do you mind repeating that into the microphone? Okay.
You didn't hear me with my great voice? I'll just say, talking to the microphone, I'm a teacher.
Go ahead. Get it close.
Okay. Oh my Lord, have mercy. I just came back from 18 days up in British Columbia, and I visited 15 islands that were owned by the indigenous people. They don't call them Native American, obviously. I was so impressed with the positive nature that they have in Canada and all over with the indigenous people compared to what we have. They were given their land back. In fact, the floating resort that we stayed at was owned by the indigenous people, and just everything, the climate and everything around there was so well taken care of. I don't know what we did wrong here.
And I'll just add again back to Alona Street Stewart. She works with an organization through the church called Restorative Action. And I would say that is a step on this journey, is to think about things like repair, reconciliation, and potential reparations. And so, again, we can direct people to websites that talk about that. We can direct people to experiences like you found in British Columbia, where that has been made a high priority. But again, we're an archive. We want to provide information and resources, historical and otherwise, and we want to be an institution that helps promote conversation.
I'll give you some things that I got.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to, and you may already know about this, but our last 3 Didier seminars would be something that I feel like might be helpful. The most recent one was, I might mispronounce his name, Rauschenbusch. It talked about Shall the Christian Nationalists Win? And the one before that was just 2 in a row from Janine Hill Fletcher, talking about Christianity and religious diversity, and before that, Christian entanglement with racism, facing the past and transforming the future. It was like a wonderful triple header, and they're on our website, but those speakers were all so good. And Janine, I think she's like in Cleveland or something. She's east of here, closer to you. Yeah, anyway.
I'm very glad to hear that. So it sounds like this congregation in particular then has already been thinking about some of these issues. Yes, and that's one reason we're asking this question as we travel around, because I'm amazed at the different approaches and the different resources that congregations are using. And other entities in the denomination are trying to collect these as well, but I think as an archive, we want to know what people are reading, what they're viewing, what they're listening to, and what they're thinking about, because I know at the very least historians are going to want to look back at this very crucial time for the church, and I would say for our country, and how, what was shaping conversation and thought. So I'm glad to hear about those. I will look for those. Yes, and I see that as one of our roles, because we get that question about, what are other people doing? And I want to be able to have a place to point people to, congregations and Presbyterians.
In today's sermon, Dr. Wilkinson talked about the merger of the Northern Church and the Southern Church. I don't like the Southern Presbyterians, quite frankly. I think they bring a dysfunctional aspect to the church, but we have the merger. So my question for you is, what can you bring to the table that will help bring in and reconcile the Southern Baptist, or the Southern, oh God, that was a Freudian slip, the Southern Presbyterian Church, and what can you do to assuage or alleviate my clear bias that I don't like what they are saying?
I will. No solutions from me, but I will just say, move back up here. I will admit to some of those same biases before I started looking into the history, and I would say it's complicated. It's more complicated than kind of a very racist, conservative Southern church, the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., and a more liberal, forward-thinking Northern denomination. One thing that surprised me about ministers and members, obviously not everyone, but in the Presbyterian Church Presbyterian Church in the U.S., is there were parts of that denomination that supported the civil rights movement, that were very much into looking at issues within their community, like poverty, like healthcare, and doing some of the same kinds of addressing those social justice issues that people tend to associate more with the Northern Church. There were folks very on the kind of more conservative end of the Presbyterian Church in the USA and the United Presbyterian Church that were much more in line with conservative thinking on race, on church structure, on the place of religion in people's lives. They were much closer together with some of the Southern Presbyterians. So one of the things I love about history is that if you really start to interrogate it and ask questions of it and look for individual stories and stories of congregations, it's much more complicated than I think any of us learned in a class on Presbyterian history. Maybe if you were becoming a member of a church and you kind of had, the Presbyterian History 101, but also about history that you learned in school, right? Because it's not that our lives are separate into our lives as Presbyterians or in religion, and all of the things that impact us and our congregations and what we decide is important. That there is no complete separation. So in terms of a solution, what I would offer as an archivist and a historian is much more accessible, different perspectives. And John is eager to add something, which I will always allow that. So here you go.
Yes, not that another hour to this, but I think ditto everything that Nancy said. And in fact, if you get William Yu's book, it will really lay out the complexity of both the Northern and Southern church's role in slavery and racism, which we easily forget. So that's just one kind of data point to speak to Nancy's response, which I think it's, we don't love answers that say it's complicated, but in fact it is complicated, and it's a good time to interrogate all of this stuff. But I think what the reunion did, and 40 years in, it's not like we're going to undo that, but what the reunion did was allowed pockets in each denomination to find common cause in the other denominations as well for all sorts of reasons across the spectrum. It's really kind of interesting because most of the, well, I'll just leave it at that. And Nancy and I have this conversation all the time, books that need to be written. This is one of those books, kind of reunion 40 years later, what are the implications? But it's a great question. So I'll say it again, it's called What Kind of Christianity? And then it has a subtitle that you won't need to find, but You, William You, Y-O-O. So if you just Google that, you'll be able to find it. And it's as I said, worth pursuing. It's a heavy read, so therefore it's not a fast read, but it's an important read. And lots of his work for this book was done at the Historical Society, so it's another way to kind of connect all the dots of this conversation.
I think it's easy for us to disparage the Southern Presbyterians when we haven't looked at the history of our church with regard to Native American people and anti-Semitism.
Thank you. I can tell that resonated with folks in this room. That's fine. I'm glad I can bring the microphone.
Thanks for that mention, Jan. Everybody else, one of us has a focus in mind is the anti-Judaism that is possible to be interpreted from our tradition and its historical terrible effects. And I think recognition of the fact that for the first time in our country, it has become a national project to address that. And my interest is, what is our history of dealing with that in our church? I know we have study papers, we have one underway right now, so what has been that history?
And I think you said anti-Judaism, is that right? Okay.
Lisa mentioned, Janine Hill Fletcher did take on Christian superiority and the idea that God wants the world to in our diverse time.
Especially in the 19th century, there were some organized effort to evangelize and convert Jews. That was a relatively small effort, I would say, over the kind of whole historic scope of the denomination. There has been limited but some recognition of anti-Semitism. I think you've probably heard this, that in this country, most Protestant churches were slow in recognizing, for example, the impacts of the Holocaust, were reluctant to welcome immigrants from Europe that were trying to escape persecution. So the Presbyterian Church, this is not my expertise, but I think you can definitely trace different attitudes and how that's changed over time. What folks have been talking about most recently is Palestinian-Israeli issues, and what should the church, the Presbyterian Church USA, what stand should the church take on that, and how should that be talked about and presented in congregations. So it's definitely something that is getting some traction. It ebbs and flows, I would say, but I can remember within the last decade there have been some debates at General Assemblies where talking about what are generally kind of lumped into Middle East issues and Middle East concerns has dominated the dialogue at General Assemblies. So I'm not really exactly completely answering your question, but there is history about this, and there is ongoing within the Presbyterian Church USA resources and dialogue about these issues. So.
There's a place for, and very neat of courage of people who went against the flow, and that they be clearly recorded, because obviously in all groups people are doing things that are probably detrimental to their reputation and their families' tolerance, and they stand up in history, and we need to remember them, because when we talk about those things.
I agree, and I've learned a lot from hearing the stories of those people, and it makes me, as an individual person and a Presbyterian, want to open space for those people and support them, because that is still happening today. I think being open to hearing people's experiences and learning their personal stories does a great service toward enabling conversation. But you are right, there are people that really tend to start that. And sometimes they're obvious leaders and sometimes they're not. And sometimes that has been completely lost to history. And we want to recover that.
You obviously archive things, but how do you present, for example, if you take the theology of Presbyterianism over the time, do you make that available, or is that just there as part of the record?
We have collections of published books on theology, systematic theology. There's so many different versions of that. We have books in our collection that go back to the Reformation, so Calvin's Institutes. We, though, are not a kind of theological institution, and there are seminaries within the PCOSA or affiliated with the PCOSA that have much richer collections than we do. So I will fully admit that we may lift up some theological debates and how they interact with other issues in the church, but that right now is not our specialty and our forte. There are other organizations within the church that we collaborate with, and that we leave a lot of that very, from my perspective, since I did not go to seminary, those kind of very nuanced theological debates, we have evidence in our collection about what ministers and leaders and the General Assembly was saying, but there is so much more that we do not have. And so we are very good at referring people when we do not have the material to some place that they can get at it or have better context than we're able to provide.
I just wanted to say thank you to both of you for being here. I forgot to say that before. And I also just wanted to ask you, I was fascinated by the fact that you're doing oral histories. Who do you find your subjects?
I will say first that these are basically now video histories. You may have this, remember those portable cassette recorders, and you'd put the blank cassette in and the little microphone, and you'd have people talk into that. Some oral, just audio histories are still done using phones, right? So they're digital. But a lot of them now are video histories, so people are talking on camera. Before the pandemic, we tended to feel like we had to do these mainly in person. And so that was a burden on traveling around. We knew people we wanted to get on, we wanted them, on tape, I'll just use that word, to tell their history from their own perspectives. We were especially trying to identify either folks that did not have a lot of published work out there, and so we felt like doing that interview was the best way to bring that story into the historical record. We also, though, were looking for people that have a particular way of speaking and thinking, and we felt like even though we might have books that they had written or records they had created in paper, it was really important to capture them speaking and their kind of presence. During the pandemic, we pivoted to Zoom, like probably a lot of you all did, and we discovered that you actually can do some really good oral histories by just recording Zoom calls. And so that has expanded the number of histories and testimonies and stories that we have been able to bring in. Just because you can do those quickly, you don't have to travel around. And we are picking up partners who are also doing oral history projects around the denomination. These digital files, these recordings, are fairly easy for us to bring in and to preserve. And there are different transcription services out there that can generate a written transcript of what's being said. And over the last 10 years, those have gotten better and better, at least for some subjects that are speaking, especially if they speak kind of standard white American English. You don't have to do a lot of correction. The computer-generated transcript is really pretty good. We use one service that is starting to learn because we send a lot of ours. It's a service called Trent. So they now can distinguish the difference between the word Presbyterian and presbytery. So we are contributing to computer knowledge, AI, in terms of making sure that we have audio, video, and a written record that comes out of these interviews. It's a fascinating way to do history. And I will just add that I'm sure you know that young people and their kind of digital technology and how for at least some of them making videos has become just a real great way to express their world and how they see it. I know there are some congregations that are using that and interesting the youth of the church to do their own video interviews of members and to create short videos. So in my mind, the technology has greatly improved the ability to do this in a way that doesn't involve a lot of resources, and we are definitely taking advantage of that. So. She said, just so it's not TikTok and Snapchat. So. Any questions you have about what we might do? I don't want to just limit it to kind of what I focused on this morning.
What is the relationship with you and like Ancestry.com, my Family Search,
So the question was, what is our relationship, for example, to Ancestry.com and other genealogical services? We do get a lot of genealogists that want to use the congregation records in our holdings. We have almost 40,000 cubic feet of church records, and a lot of that is congregation records. For a number of the people that would come to us, they're not currently Presbyterians, but they had Presbyterian ancestors, and they want to try to trace their ancestors through, for example, the church registers and the lists of baptisms and marriages. We decided, Ancestry approached us, so we did not approach Ancestry, I want to make that clear, but they approached us early in the 2010s and offered us a project we felt like we couldn't refuse. They came into our archive, digitized on site, so the records didn't have to go anywhere, church registers up until 1970, so nothing really recent, but everything in our holdings from congregations around the country. to 1970. They did that at their expense. And they created the name index that you may be familiar with, how you search by name in Ancestry. Up until that point, all we could do for people was try to help them figure out what church your ancestor may have gone to. There was no way to search by name in our paper records. And so all of those scans, that name index is now part of Ancestry.com. We still have people that come to us and either they don't have access to Ancestry or we've gotten records since that project concluded, and we will help genealogists. So we do that. We do not turn people away. It's one advantage for churches to potentially deposit records with us, because then they can send genealogists to us. So, right, not people in their congregations, but general public people that may call the office and say, I'm looking for a baptism of my great-great-great-great-grandfather or something like that. If the records are with us, they would work through us. So that's making that service available is something we do because we have the records. I would say that it's not a direct ministry within the church, right? But we're not just going to deny access to that information, no matter who comes to us or why they want the information. I want to thank you all so much. You've been a great audience. I so appreciate your comments. And Lucy Duxon Bramble is here, and she is our Director of Development. We are going to be doing a small campaign. We're in the quiet phase right now, and what we are raising money primarily for is to continue our outreach and to have a staff person primarily responsible for creating these resources. Right now, that's spread among several different staff members, and we are just finding we don't have quite enough time and bandwidth, but we feel like this is so important. Lucy, do you want to just say a little bit about what you do? And then all of us, Lucy, and I think John as well, will be here afterwards to answer your questions, and I urge you to pick up some of our literature. Everything on the table you can take with you. So,
thank you. Thank you again for having us this afternoon. I've been with the Historical Society for not quite 2 years, and my responsibility is to raise that 1/3 of income that we need to do the work, to do all of the work that we need to do. I work with individuals, congregations. I also do some grant writing, multiple ways of income that can come into the Historical Society. And I have to say that one of the things that I've learned in the past year and a half is that our donors appreciate the fact that we have the records that are available to them, and they support us, and they want us to continue to do the work that we do for the denomination. And on a personal note, and I always tell this story, because my family doesn't have a whole lot of history, especially on my mom's side, when I came to the Historical Society to work, I said, well, this is the church that I was born into. It was a Presbyterian church in Philadelphia. And they were able to find records of my grandparents, my mom and my dad's marriage, my mom's siblings. And so we have records that my family didn't even realize were available. And so for someone who doesn't have a long history or ability to have a lot of our records, the Historical Society has been helpful to me, and I'm sure helpful to other people. So I love the fact that as a third-generation Presbyterian, I get a chance to help raise funds to continue the work that we do at the Historical Society. So I hope that you will find it in your graciousness to maybe support our major campaign that's coming up. But please feel free to reach out to the Historical Society for information. I cannot underscore how important it is that we have the records and that we can share them. So I don't think, do you have any questions for me? I think Nancy answered a lot of questions. But thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Lucy. I wanted to make sure, Lucy.